Today we are going to take a look at the best vampire novels ever, according to my tastes and opinion. Of course, they may clash with yours. Now, this is a list that's going to change year after year based on more books that I read, and sometimes depending on my taste as well. My taste may change over time. There will be no best of series list this year to go along with this one because I only read one series this year. And that would be a very short and very uneventful list. So, as it is, this list is going to be pretty short as well. I intend for this to be 10 books, because top 10 lists are pretty nice. Everyone loves top 10 lists. But I have not read enough really good books for there to be a top 10. So there are instead going to be 6 books in this video this year. Hopefully 10 next year. We will see. These books are all pretty incredible in my mind, but I'm going to rank them in particular in the order that I think is best. So in that case, I'm going to go with number 6 being I Am Legend and Other Stories by Richard Matheson. Now, I Am Legend is pretty notable for the fact that it has a more scientific approach to vampirism, which at the time this story was originally released, which is 1950s, 1957 or 59 or something like that, that was not a thing you would see at that time. And it follows the protagonist of the story. I'm sorry, I can't remember what the protagonist's name is, but he believes he is the last human alive, and during the night he keeps himself cooped up in his house that he's made pretty self-sufficient for himself for the most part, while zombie-like vampires are trying to claw at the house on the outside and trying to break their way in to feed on him. During the day, he goes out and about to find more food, more resources, and to try and learn more about the virus that decimated humanity and turned them into vampires. And that, I find, is pretty intriguing. I knew pretty much nothing about the story originally going into this book, so I didn't know it was going to be strongly science-based, and I am pretty thrilled with the fact that this is the case. I really like seeing how people try to scientifically justify something fictional like human vampirism. It's very intriguing to me, and I love how Richard Matheson approached this. This collection also has the benefit of also having several other horror stories in it that happen to be really well written, and, in my opinion, showcases a wide variety of horror fiction. So if you're someone like me who, prior to this, you didn't fully understand horror fiction, and it was more horror TV shows and films that rely more on shock value, I feel this will help you understand horror a little bit more. At least for me, it did. So This is a 4-star book. It is not perfect, but pretty close. There was not too much I really disliked about this one, and I'm really happy that it was a recommended book to me. Book number 5 that I'm going to rhyme off is Blood and Gold by Anne Rice. This was the second Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles book that I ever read. It was the first one I owned. And it is the origin story of Marius, or rather, the portions of his origin story that we didn't already know by this point. If you've been reading the Vampire Chronicles in order, as I've been doing for this channel this past year, then you would know that by the time you get to Blood and Gold, there's already several portions of Marius's life that we know of, that we're already aware of. So one of the positives about Blood and Gold, and one of the reasons why I love the book so much, is not only because it features Marius, who is, in my opinion, my favorite character in the entire series, but also due to the fact that it showcases what we didn't already know about his life, or it expands upon what we already knew from his side of the story. So before, you had other characters saying what their point of view of what their experiences with him were and what he told them. But this is Marius actually going through and talking about all the rest of the stuff that he wants to talk about. So I enjoyed this book the first time I read it when I didn't know as much about Marius as I do now. But now that I know a lot more about him, I greatly respect Maurice's character even more. Not a perfect book, it's 4 stars, but it's a worthy entry to the Vampire Chronicles. It's definitely one of the better books in the series, and it comes highly recommended from me. Book number 4 on this list is Interview with the Vampire. This is the first book in the Vampire Chronicles. If there's one book in the series that everyone recommends you read, it's generally this one. And it's definitely one of the best. It introduces the sympathetic vampire. Prior to the publication of this book, you didn't see that very much, if at all. And this is a vampire who is very human. Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, out of all the vampires in the Vampire Chronicles, is one of the most, if not the most human, and the most relatable as a result. And it was a very interesting choice to have this book from his perspective, especially since Lestat de Liancourt, who is a secondary character in this book, is the protagonist of the entire series, right? So you're introducing your series protagonist in a story in which he's only a supporting character in. I don't recall any other book I've read so far that takes that same kind of approach. And it's definitely very intriguing how it portrays depression, I think, because Louis has a lot. He's very cynical. He does come across to me as being someone who is depressed or suffers from depression. And I love that it's not stigmatized. I love that it just seems to be portrayed as something that is normal for him. And I understand why some people are turned off by that, but that to me is one of the positives about this book. And there is so much that happens to Louis within like the 60 or 70 year time frame that most of the story takes place in. You're not really bored. You're not really bored at all. And it's a very difficult book to put down. Anne Rice's writing style is very, very easy to read, in my opinion. And I agree with a lot of people's recommendations. If there's one book in the series that is a guaranteed read, or at least a good one to start with, it is Interview with the Vampire. And especially since, like, this book is told almost entirely through dialogue. There are some points that there's a little bit of third-person narration, but 95 to 98% of the book, I'd probably say, is through first-person dialogue, as told by Louis to the young man who's interviewing him, which is something that you also don't see very much in fiction, from my experience. So sometimes it turns people off as well, and there is a little bit of repetition at the parts in which there is the third-person narration, but it didn't happen so often that I was turned off by it. Sometimes it was kind of nice to have a bit of a break in the constant first-person speech for something a little bit different. I don't think it was necessary. Sometimes I had to be reminded that the interviewer was there, because there were times I just forgot that there was anyone but Louis. Book number 3 on this list is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. Now, this one was an interesting read for me because this was the first Stephen King book I read. And to date, it is the only one I've read. I don't really have plans on reading any other ones. Maybe The Dark Tower later on down the line, but that's kind of iffy. And Salem's Lot is more or less a more modern retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula. You have a vampire who's managed to make his way to the town and live in the old house on the hill. He has a servant who's been running a business as a kind of, what would you say? As like a side hustle, as like a thing to help conceal what the vampire is doing. And gradually, over the course of the book, the entire town is consumed. This is not a happy ending type book like Dracula is. It's definitely, I mean, if you're someone who's read Stephen King before this book, it's probably your quintessential Stephen King. For me, I was just happy that it wasn't all, all happy. Like, if you have some really old and very powerful and twisted vampire that came into a small town. No one knows what's going on. Everyone's ignorant. Then it's only a matter of time before all hell breaks loose. And the way it was handled, like there were things that happened that I didn't really expect. Don't expect it to happen in the same kind of a way. There are, because it's based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, there are a lot of things you can say, oh hey, I know this with this. You can kind of mash those up. But it just, even for it being the only Stephen King book I read, it just seems very much like his own thing. Kind of like when you have movies that are based on a particular source material, but are otherwise completely unrelated to that source material. There are connections, but it's otherwise very much Stephen King's own book. But, you know, it might be a consequence of the fact that I had some preconceived notions about this book, but the fact that it turned out to be so good when I wasn't expecting that to be the case. I'll be honest, I heard some things from people who are not fan of Stephen King's writing, that they're like, oh, I don't like his books because of this, this, and this, blah, blah, blah. I wasn't really expecting much, and I came out of the book going, wow, this is incredible. Not a perfect book by any stretch, but it's really, really good, and Stephen King's writing style really vibes with me very, very well. I'm okay with that kind of wordy, slow burn type thing, because the way the burn happens is just, it's gradual, but it's not so slow that it turns you off from it. You know, it's just enough to tease you, to keep you going, that once you finally get to the main event, then it hits you. Book number 2 on this list is The Vampire Lestat by Anne Rice. This is the sequel to Interview with the Vampire, and this is a 5-star book for me, and it's rare for me to give books 5 stars. For a book to be 5 stars like this one, especially a sequel, it had to have been better than the previous book, right? As you might expect, this is Lestat's story, but unlike Interview with the Vampire, where it's, you know, Louis is getting interviewed by this young man, and, you know, you're hearing everything through dialogue and blah, blah, blah. This is Lestat writing his own book. It's very interesting to learn more about Lestat as a character, and over the course of the book, you learn about what happened, some of his early life, you learn about how he became a vampire, and what happened after the fact. There's a lot that happens to Lestat in a short time frame by vampire standards. It's very interesting to read through all of that and see how it interconnects with Louis' story from the previous book. And it takes everything that was good about Interview with the Vampire and makes it better. Way better. I feel like even if you didn't like Interview with the Vampire, I think you should still read The Vampire Lestat, because from what I've seen by reviews from other people and complaints by those people, a lot of what people didn't like about Interview with the Vampire was either, I wouldn't necessarily say retconned, but it was expanded upon and explained, so you understood why certain things happened the way they did. And not so much because it touches on a lot from Interview with the Vampire, because it really doesn't. It really doesn't do that. So much of it is very much Lestat's own story. And Interview with the Vampire is only touched on in the latter quarter or so of the book, maybe. Much of it is just new stuff that is Lestat's own origin story, right? So, but the way things happen and the way things are told, you figure out over the course of the book some things about Interview with the Vampire that may have been kind of So in that case, I feel like if you didn't like Interview with the Vampire and you're debating whether you should give up on the Vampire Chronicles entirely, I would wait until after you read The Vampire Lestat. I would wait until then. And my number one book, my number one vampire novel of all time, as of the end of 2020, is Let the Right One In by George Avid Lindquist. Lindqvist is a Swedish author. This book wasn't originally in English. It was translated to English, but you wouldn't know it. It's just the book is written so well, and the translator brought out the author's voice and prose and everything so well. This book more or less follows a boy named Oscar, who he's a school-age boy. He is unfortunately a victim of bullying. His parents are separated or divorced due to his father's alcoholism. There's a lot of very heavy topics in this book, and make no mistake about it, just because the protagonist is a school-age boy does not mean this book is appropriate for children. It is not a children's book. It is an adult horror novel. There's a lot of things in this book that are very adult and might even disturb some adults. So just as a warning, in case there's some things in it that might be a bit sensitive to you, especially when it comes to, there is a bit of a touch on, because there is a pedophile in this book, there is a bit of a touch on pedophilia. Not a lot happens, but it's teased, so that might make some people uncomfortable. And the bullying in this book does get pretty extreme at multiple points. So that's probably the worst, I would say. There's a couple other things that are mentioned or described in just a little, only very slight detail. But despite all of that, despite how heavy the book is, despite how disturbing some things in the book are, the way it was written, just everything about it, I couldn't put the book down. Like, I couldn't stop reading the book. There were times where I had to do other things, and I really didn't want to. I had to keep reading. And whether you pick up a version of the book with the original title, Let the Right One In, or you pick up like the version of the book that I did, Let Me In, it's the exact same book, just a slightly different title. The American movie version was Let Me In, which I think is why they gave this version of the book that title. But it's the same book. So it'll take a lot to dethrone this book as my favorite vampire novel of all time, because, oh man. And then, on top of all of that, it also takes a different approach to vampirism that I did not expect. And when it came about, I was just like, this is brilliant. I love this. And just, I can't recommend this book enough. I can't. There we go. Those are my favorite vampire novels of all time as of the end of 2020. Again, this is going to be changing on a yearly basis, so next year there will be different books on this list, especially since we're only 6 books and not 10. And next year, hopefully I have a series list. I look forward to hearing from you guys. If there's any vampire novels you read this year, what are your favorites? Are there other ones that I mentioned? What about ones that you've read that I haven't yet? I'm genuinely very curious. I have a lot of vampire books on my TBR, owned or not, that I haven't read yet. And I really, really want to know what you guys think. And as the last video of 2020 on this channel, I just want to thank everyone who has ever watched one of my videos. Every one of you has subscribed, commented. Even if I may not necessarily have replied to your comment, I do try to look at every single one of them. I don't always get notified, so if I missed yours, I apologize. I would like to thank you for making this first year of this YouTube channel an incredible one, for me at least. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys in 2021. Bye!